In 1913, dancer Isadora Duncan had opened a new school at Bellevue. It was called the Temple of Dance of the Future, a kind of performing arts school for children. Ernest Grappelli asked her if she would take Stephane as a pupil, and she agreed. His time at Isadora's school didn't last long, but it was a bit of a revelation to him. "I wasn't born to be a dancer," he admitted later, remembering being dressed up in white Grecian-style robes and a wreath of roses. But even at 6 years old, Stephane loved the music.
That's the first time I really heard some music, because Isadora Duncan loved music very much. Of course, she needed to dance. And sometimes she didn't hesitate to book a philharmonic. And I remember the one, I was 6 years old when I heard the first time the Après-midi d'Info of Debussy, which opened my ear once for all.
Stephane's friend, guitarist John Etheridge, thinks Isadora's influence may have been even more significant.
This Isadora Duncan experience had a kind of quite a profound influence, because she was promoting this idea of the free spirit, and he was really, despite all these street kid insecurities, he was a very free spirit. And I mean, one of his real horrors was to be pinned emotionally or psychologically. I mean, he really avoided that all his life.
In 1914, war broke out, and this caused the closure of the school. Isadora took herself and her pupils off to England, but Stephane stayed behind in Paris and went back to the nuns and the charity orphanages. Poor Ernest had been called up into the Italian army. Life in Paris during the war was pretty bad anyway, but in an orphanage it must have been much worse. There was little food and less comfort. Then, miraculously, his father came back, found a room for them, and took his son home. There were no more orphanages for Stephane, but his father still had to travel in search of teaching or translating jobs, and from the age of about 12, Stephane was simply left alone to fend for himself. This self-sufficiency was something which was to stay with him through the years, as was the desire for a reasonably comfortable way of life. John Etheridge.
He grew up, and he carried always with him, I think, a massive level of a kind of insecurity. Not musical, totally secure. But he had that feeling that every day he had to go out and earn his money and make sure he was okay. You've got to remember that first of all, he thought of himself as somebody who needed to earn a living as a musician. And I think that was one of his keys to this wonderfully unpretentious character he had.
Father and son loved music and would spend some of their small income each week on the cheapest tickets for classical concerts. Then one of his father's friends, an Italian shoemaker, gave Stephane a half-size violin. At the same time, his father, who knew all the theory, if not the practice, began to teach him to read music. He learned to play, and perhaps as importantly, he learned to perform for an audience, to give pleasure with his own talent. He began to play for money and then got a job accompanying silent films in the Gaumont Theatre. He spent 2 years there, playing for 6 hours a day, and it was an education for him. The band included a pianist, a cellist, and another violinist, and they played all kinds of music, including Mozart and Schumann, as well as popular tunes and dance music. But new fashions in music were coming from the New World, along with the movies. Close to Stephane's cinema was a little shop which contained an early jukebox. Stephane would go in and listen. This little shop was the first place that Stephane heard Teeth for Two.
When I was about 16 or nearly 17, I started to play in dancing. And of course we were playing some foxtrot and some American music. Well, it was the first time I heard T42, for instance, which was a revelation for me. I never heard that, and I like that music a lot.
They began to play this kind of music in the cinema, suiting the music to the films. Charlie Chaplin was a great favourite with Stephane, and soon the other music that came pouring out of America, Gershwin, Louis Armstrong, Bix Beiderbecke, enchanted him. His cinema job wasn't very well paid, so in 1925 he left and undertook a variety of other musical jobs, including a spell playing at a dancing school. The more jazz Stephane heard, the more he began to wonder about the possibilities of the violin for playing jazz. The problem was that the violin just couldn't compete with the noise of brass and drums. But But Stephane could also play the piano, and now he began to play it professionally, joining one of the leading French bands, Gregor and his Gregorians.
When I was about 21, I think, or 22, I went to a great orchestra called Gregor and his Gregorians. And that was the first time in my life I played with a large orchestra. And I was very interested because I can start doing arranging, you see, for that orchestra.
He was and remained a talented pianist. But then in the summer of 1929, the great Gregor himself asked to hear Stephane play the violin. And Gregor decided that Stephane should go back to his first love. Stephane agreed. In 1931, Stephane was playing in Le Croix du Sud, a very successful club in Paris, when he found himself being stared at by a villainous-looking character who looked more than anything else as if he wanted to fight. He was like a gangster, straight out of an American film. When he moved towards the orchestra, Stephane stepped backwards in alarm and almost fell off the bandstand.
One night I saw a young man, very brown of skin, with funny eyes and looking at me when I was playing the violin. He said, oh, he presents himself. My name is Django. And I say, who? Django. And I played the guitar. I would like to meet you sometime. And we meet. He was playing the banjo. When I heard that, I couldn't believe what I heard. Fantastic chord. I said, where you learn all that? He laughed, of course, because he can't even sign his name. It was Django Reinhardt.
This was the first meeting between Stephane Grappelli and Django Reinhardt. Django told Stephane that he could play the guitar pretty well and that he was looking for a violinist. Stephane was exactly what Django was looking for, a fiddler who could play jazz. Their admiration for each other's music was mutual. Each began to recognize the amazing skills of the other, though Stephane thought that Django himself didn't inspire confidence. Maybe his unreliability reminded Stephane too much of his own father. But their careers took them in different directions. And then?
2 years later, I was near him, and we start again to amuse ourselves, to play. And the bass player heard that, and he came with his bass. And you know, little, all that start like that. And we were only 4, 2 guitars, Django's brother, a bass player, and myself. We take his cousin, and alors we call that the quintet of the Coupe de France.
Although the Hot Club Quintet was very successful, it was always an informal arrangement, and all its members had other fish to fry. Still, the Grappelli-Reinhardt partnership produced some truly amazing results. There was nothing like it before, and there's been nothing quite like it since. It was inspired. Nigel Kennedy and Professor of Guitar, Simon Dinnigan.
It had a kick in it, that sound, it got an energy in it, and a natural quality.
A guitarist had never actually been at the same level musically or kind of lyrically speaking as a violinist. I mean, we all know that the violin is an extremely lyrical instrument in any kind of aspect of music. And to actually come across a guitarist who could actually play in unison with a violin as lyrically and as subtly and with tonal changes and contrasts of mood on the edge of a phrase, I think was quite special.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, Stephane stayed in London while Django went back to France. The partnership would never be so close again. John Etheridge.
When they were together, it was such a powerful combination. And in many ways, there were such disparate personalities. I often get the impression that Stephane was quite happy when Django wasn't around, you know. Django's personality was obviously very dominating and quite oppressive. And I think, you know, part of Stephane's sort of love-hate relationship with Django was to do with this heavy and secure and very arrogant man, you know. What was important was that Django and Stephane were the first European musicians to, A, do quite well, B, produce a product that was recognisably not American, and C, get some respect from American musicians and audience, actually.
Stephane became very unwell in London, The Musicians' Union organised his medical treatment, and when he'd recovered, he was asked to form a band with pianist Arthur Young at a stylish but rather conservative place called Hatchett's in Piccadilly. When Arthur Young was injured in the bombing, the band employed a new pianist, George Shearing, then only 20 years old, blind and immensely talented. This too began a long and fruitful partnership for the pair of them. Once more, each recognised the other's quality, though George was maybe a bit more reliable than Django. In the summer of 1941, Stephane was again in hospital, being operated on for a serious kidney problem. It was touch and go for a while, but he recovered and bought himself a cottage in Devon for his convalescence. Thereafter, Stephane began to do very well in Britain, broadcasting for the BBC and recording and playing with his own group, which included George Shearing and guitarist Denny Wright. At the end of the war, there was a reunion between Stephane and Django, and a recording session was set up. They played Embraceable You, a version of Tiger Rag and Nuage, among many others. The playing is smooth and confident, but something's missing. And perhaps it was simply that time had changed both of them. Django wanted to stay at home in France. Music too was moving on. Still, they continued to play together on and off until Django's sadly premature death in 1953.
Django became, he won't leave his home, he wanted to stay there, and he was very disappointed for the change of music it was at that time, if you remember, when the bebop came and all that. And I feel Django was a bit disturbed by that, and he stopped to play for months, or he still disappeared, and it was very difficult to find. Then I heard about the end, of course. He had the stroke, and I couldn't come in at once because I was in Italy at that time. I heard that too late.
In 1954, Stephane had gallbladder trouble and went into hospital yet again for an operation. In later years, he was to say that the reason he managed to lead such a long and robust life was that there was nothing left inside him. Still, his health was quite fragile at this time, and he moved back to France, where the weather was better. He was never short of work in France. Everyone seemed to love him, and he was playing music that everyone liked, and yet there seemed to be something lacking in his career so far. Part of the problem was that he was almost too versatile, could turn his hand to anything, and was averse to self-promotion. He didn't care much about playing with names, he just enjoyed playing, all of which meant that he didn't quite get the recognition he deserved. Not at this time, anyway. Still, he always believed that in life one must go forward, even at the age of 52. But after Django's death, Stephane seemed to be a member of a lost generation of jazzmen, and he had the wrong credentials too. He'd been a poor white boy, but he had made good, and there was a certain inverted snobbery in jazz circles, in France at least. Stephane had not suffered enough. He was not radical enough. That was what some critics thought. The Hot Club recordings were reissued, and although this was good for Stephane, it too had its downside. Django, being dead, had become the legend, and Stephane must have grown very tired of being treated as a source of information about the gypsy, or worse, being called Django's violinist, or faintly praised for his interpretation of Django's ideas. One critic even said that Grappelli could not really be considered an outstanding jazz musician.